Welcome to World History. Today we're going to tell the story of the Haitian Revolution, one of the only successful slave revolts in world history. So, let's get started. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the situation in Haiti that led to the revolution, evaluate Toussaint Louverture's vision for an independent Haiti and the challenges he faced in achieving that vision, and then in general assess the effectiveness of the Haitian Revolution. So let's get started with our story. The colony of Saint-Domingue, or what is today known as Haiti, was a French sugar colony. And so, of course, as we talked about previously, that meant that they were predominantly growers of sugarcane. They had plantation-style agriculture. And, of course, they also grew some smaller crops like coffee and indigo. Most of the sugar plantations in Haiti were in sort of the northern plains area, and so this is going to be the main area where the rebellion is going to break out. As we hopefully remember from earlier classes, sugar cultivation is absolutely brutal. And so the enslaved people in Haiti suffered terribly under the watchful oversight of the plantation managers, who forced them to work incredibly long hours in order to produce this incredibly lucrative crop under very dangerous conditions. And so life for enslaved people in Haiti was, of course, very, very unpleasant. Because Haiti was a slave society, the racial makeup of the colony is somewhat important. It's important to note that about 90% of the Haitian population was enslaved people, with a small group of free non-white people and a small group of free white people within the colony. When you look at the different classes of people, the plantation owners, the big whites, owned most of the sugar plantations and had most of the money, but there was a large group of free people of color who also had some significant sugar assets and grew some coffee and also had significant money. So you've got these two groups, both of whom are incredibly wealthy. Then you've got a group of small white people on the island who generally took jobs as plantation managers and things like that. They had very little money and often struggled to find work because they had to compete with enslaved people, and there just weren't that many jobs for them. And then at the same time, you had the enslaved people. They had to work incredibly difficult hours under really, really rough conditions, and their lives were pretty terrible. For a long time in Haiti, race, beyond the whole enslavement thing, race was not a huge deal. And the slaves had some protections under a law known as the Code Noir. But in the mid-1700s, the Code Noir was repealed, and a racial caste system similar to the Spanish colonies was set up to reinforce white supremacy. This is really where our story kicks off, because this new system enforcing white supremacy is going to really outrage the free people of color who have spent their lives building up relatively pleasant lives for themselves in Saint-Domingue and suddenly find themselves second-class citizens. Then, in order to make things more complicated, the French Revolution happens and the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen are passed, promoting equality for all. So, whether the racist caste system should dominate Haitian society or the Declaration of Rights of Man should dominate Haitian society is one of the central fault lines that's going to lead to the Haitian Revolution. And of course, the Declaration of Rights of Man says that all men are born free and equal. So what does this say about enslaved people? All of these questions are going to be worked out as our story goes forward. The Haitian Revolution starts with what is called the Three Revolts. The Three Revolts are revolts from three of the different groups of people. First, when the Declaration of Rights of Man is promulgated in the colony, we get a revolt from the small whites. The small whites rise up in order to try to prevent the people of color from getting their rights. The people of color, of course, resent this and revolt. And these two groups the free people of color and the small whites both raise armies and decide to go to war against each other in order to try to figure out whether or not racial equality for free people in Haiti is going to be the rule. But as they're doing this, the enslaved people look around and realize, like, this is pretty crazy. 90% of us are enslaved, and these small groups of free people are fighting this massive civil war over whether or not they should be equal when we are suffering horribly. And so what ends up happening is a massive slave revolt gets organized. There's this ceremony known as the Boys Came On ceremony, in which the enslaved people, led by a priest named Bookman, start to organize the slave population in order to revolt against both the whites and the free people of color. And so they launch this massive slave revolt and begin burning and pillaging all of the sugar plantations across the northern part of the colony. So now Haiti's in chaos. You've got free people of color and small whites fighting over which one of them should be equal or not equal. Well, the whole northern part of the colony is burning from a massive slave revolt. So who do we have to bring order to this chaos? A guy named Toussaint Louverture, who was a former slave, who comes up with a vision to try to unite all the different groups of people. First, he reaches out in his vision of Tricolor Unity to try to unite the slaves. Bookman had died early on in the fighting in the slave revolt, and so in order to help the slaves, Toussaint promises freedom. And so Toussaint Louverture is able to convince the slave armies to join his side by promising them freedom. At the same time, he's able to get the free people of color to join his side by promising equality. And he's able to get the big whites on his side by promising that plantation agriculture is still going to be a thing. So his goal is free the slaves, provide equality for the free people of color, and keep the plantations going for the big whites. And so with this very politically savvy move, our friend Toussaint here is able to unite together enough of these three groups of people to start defeating his enemies and building, basically getting control over the island of Saint-Domingue. And so Toussaint raises this huge army and as the leader seizes control of the colony. Once Toussaint gets control over the colony, he ends up basically creating this new constitutional system in which he is going to be the leader for life, and he starts consolidating his political power. A number of Toussaint's rivals disagreed with his plan and disagreed with him becoming governor for life. And so, for example, a guy whose name you don't need to know, named André Rigaud, rises in rebellion. And in what's called the War of Knives, Toussaint and his most trusted subordinate, a guy named Dessalines. You do need to know Dessalines going forward. End up crushing Rigaud and burning most of his territory, leaving Toussaint as the undisputed master of Haiti. Unfortunately for Toussaint, in order to put his vision into motion, he does free the slaves and sets them up as a basically new group of people called cultivators who are free and do get wages, but he also forces them to go back to work. So he puts in a relatively harsh labor code with pretty fierce punishments to force the formerly enslaved people back to work in order to keep his promises to both the big whites and the people of color. And so despite the fact that, again, these enslaved people are now free, their lives are very similar to the way that they were before they were freed by Toussaint. So he's got control over the whole island, but there's a variety of different people who are now starting to dislike his rule. So as Toussaint is struggling to maintain his rule and consolidate control over the country, France returns to try to reclaim their colony. This whole thing is happening in the sort of aftermath or in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars. And so as there's a break in the fighting, Napoleon sends an army of 200,000 veterans of the Napoleonic Wars to try to retake the colony. Toussaint realizes that he probably can't defeat this army, famously saying that all of France has come to reconquer Haiti. And so he is going to order his generals, including a guy named Henri Christophe, to use a scorched earth technique, burning cities, sugarcane fields, and basically anything in their path to try to delay the French. But in the end, it's not enough. Toussaint is betrayed by some of his generals. And his plan to outlast the French until disease sets in to kill them doesn't work. He is arrested, deported, and then dies in prison. So Toussaint Louverture falls from power, and the French have now retaken the island. But French control is not to last. There's a couple reasons that the French fail to retake Saint-Domingue. The most important is the advent of yellow fever. This is a really deadly disease which hits especially Europeans really badly in the summertime. And so as the summer months start coming on, yellow fever starts hitting the French army, and they start literally dropping like flies. France also really stupidly tries to re-enslave the Haitian people, with Napoleon passing a law basically trying to reinstitute slavery. And so with all of this happening, Dessalines here rises in revolt, leading the remnants of Toussaint's coalition against the French. This fighting is incredibly brutal, with both sides committing horrible atrocities. The French start to mistrust even all of their subjects of color, and even the army, even the soldiers of color who are still fighting for the French are rounded up and killed by the thousands. The Haitians, meanwhile, start moving across the countryside, killing all the French people that they find. And in the end, the disease is enough to devastate the French forces, and Dessalines is able to re-seize control of the island from the French. Most of their leaders are killed, and Dessalines becomes the undisputed master of Saint-Domingue. From there, Dessalines declares independence for Haiti. But he also decides that the white people on the island are not to be trusted. And so he issues a general order that all French people on the island are to be killed immediately. He forces most of his generals and subordinates to participate in these massacres. And within the span of several months, thousands of French people are rounded up and summarily executed. Although this is relatively effective, it does create a lot of resentment amongst Dessalines' followers, and eventually he is overthrown by a guy named Henri Christophe, who we talked about earlier, who was one of Toussaint's lieutenants, who becomes the first king of an independent Haiti. And so with that, we go from Haiti being a sugar colony of primarily enslaved people to Haiti being a free kingdom ruled by primarily people of African descent, but with some instability and a pretty difficult bloody legacy. It should also be noted that King Henri Christophe kept a lot of Toussaint's pretty brutal labor codes and kept the vast majority of the cultivators chained to the land working on sugar plantations in order to keep the island's economy afloat. So hopefully with that, you can answer these basic questions about the Haitian Revolution, and we'll come back and fill in some of the details through the documents and in class.